Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. And last time, the video that's been uploaded together with this one, if you're on YouTube, or 4 days ago, if you are on Twitch, I aimed to talk about two kinds of failure modes of government that often does not believe in its own actions, and therefore is too hesitant to actually do things. The first is government by pilot, and the second is government by nudge. I expected to cover both in my usual streaming time of 2-ish hours, and took the entire time talking just about government by pilot. We are not going to talk about government by pilot, because that was the topic of the previous video, and instead we're going to talk about the issue of government by nudge. So first of all, I need to tell you what I mean by government by nudge. It's this kind of distinction between nudging and doing that is very, very important as a way of explaining a certain failure mode throughout the United States, but also in Europe we have this failure mode at the EU level. So one of the things I'm going to point out is how the EU level has such a sharp distinction between governments that do, and these are the member states. In some cases, these are also the subnational entities in some member states, like the German Länder. They do things. Often what they do is trash, like how Bavaria NIMBYs so successfully NIMBYs wind power, but they do things. And then the EU level doesn't do anything. The EU level only nudges, and we're going to talk about that in the issue in the context of something like cross-border rail, but because at the end it's stream about public transportation infrastructure, but it's also relevant to many other things. And again, in the United States, it's different. There isn't that kind of sharp distinction. Maybe historically there was. So there was this distinction between state governments that do, or city governments that do, and a federal government that only nudges, let's say 100 or 120 years ago. But this has changed in the sense that the federal government does more than it did then, but it doesn't really do. It still nudges. It's just a very large leviathan of nudge. I think there's an expression called leviathan by proxy. Meanwhile, the state government don't really do anything. They kind of absorb the same nudge model, partly for ideological reasons, partly because there's no real democratic oversight. And just about any American state, there are some exceptions, mostly for swing states, but these don't really build infrastructure either. So when I talk about doing and nudging, am I suddenly frozen? I don't know. So when I talk about doing and about nudging, what I mean is that let's talk for a moment about trains. And yeah, I know I have EU Army and like Young European Federation and Ukraine things here. I promise they're going to become relevant. So let's talk as a toy model about high-speed rail in Europe, and we're going to say something about Japan and Korea, but it's mostly going to be about Europe. This will move myself to here, I guess. And also shrink so that you actually can see. Okay, question. Do I need to go... Okay, now I don't know. Okay, I guess this is the screen as you're seeing it. So if I have... Okay, I see what I'm doing. Okay, I see. Sorry, I'm not used to having to not having the chat screen here, so I'm getting used to this interface. So anyway, in Europe we have high-speed rail networks, and we need to talk about how they have been built. And my point is that they were always built by governments that did things rather than nudging them. So this is the map of operational high-speed rail. Is this a nicer looking map? No, I need this one. And the point is, okay, this now I need to move my face to literally the other end. Okay, so, the biggest network is the French one. Not by length, because the Spanish one is a little longer, but by ridership. Now, Germany also has higher ridership, but that includes, I think it's all intercity versus all intercity. Germany beats France. France still narrowly beats Germany per capita. But again, in Germany, it's something very different. We're going to talk about it in a bit. But so when you think about just high-speed rail in Europe, start thinking about France. And we have all these lines. Well, I don't live there anymore. I haven't even visited since I left, unless you count being on a train between London and Brussels that may or may not have stopped in Lille. I don't remember. I didn't get off in Lille. And so the French state, SNCF, a state-owned company, built Paris to Lyon. Now, it did not get public financing the first time. It did get private financing, but the planning was done by engineers at SNCF, planners at SNCF, by architects at SNCF, figuring out things like station architecture if they were wherever they were building new stations. There were regulators making decisions about environmental protection. For example, these high-speed lines are grade separated, and they're also at grade rather than elevated, except when crossing rivers. And this means that they are a difficult barrier to cross. So how do you let wildlife pass through? So making sure that there are sufficient wildlife passages. This is something that environmental regulators decided on. This was not decided by lawsuit, for example. This was decided by the French state. And this network is built and run by the French state for a public purpose. Now, it's a public purpose based on, nowadays, what SNCF expects were very airline-oriented. They think in terms of airline-style business analysis. And that has been a problem. That the ridership on the TGV grew to about 110 million on the eve of the Great Recession, and since then it's risen from, I think, 110 to 120. So essentially stagnation in ridership since 2008. Even though some lines have opened since then. So this is post 2008. This is post 2008. I don't think this entire line is, but the second half, like this, is. So again, I'm not saying the state is perfect, but I'm saying this is something that was built by the state. The state was doing things. The state decided on the alignments, on how to build. The rolling stock is not even... and this is something that is true of France and also of the Japanese Shinkansen, and I don't think it's true of other high-speed systems. Is that the railroad also partly owns the rolling stock. So the way that it's done in, let's say, Italy or Spain is that the state, as I said, builds and runs this. Now, recently there has been private competition in Italy and in Spain. It has led to increases in ridership to levels per capita that are still so far below French or German ones. But in France and in Japan, the railroad partly owns the designs for the trains. So the TGVs, like the physical TGVs, the designs are jointly owned by Alstom and by SNCF, which essentially means SNCF gets them at cost. And if you want to buy them as a foreigner, you're going to pay a premium, and also you're not going to buy them because because the TGV rolling stock is not very good. The Shinkansen rolling stock is very good. As a foreigner, you pay a premium for it. If you're one of the JRs, you don't. And again, that's atypical in Spain, Italy, and so on. There are these standardized products, high-speed trains by Bombardier, Siemens, and so on, and then they just buy one of them. But they build and operate their own trains. And again, there's a lot of public planning involved. The public sector employs many engineers. I'm not gonna give you an order of magnitude because I don't remember the orders of magnitude for national railways and high-speed trains. I know them for metros. Metropolitana di Milano, MM. It's not the agency that runs the trains in Milan. It's the agency that builds the infrastructure. It's a public sector one. I believe it has 1,200 employees. And what they do is essentially they build infrastructure. They build urban infrastructure in Milano, and they consult for other Italian cities. So this is an example of doing. So there's a map. There's a list of priorities. They're being built. Now, of course, the construction is contracted out. This is perfectly standard. Physical construction will be contracted out to building contractors with a lot of public planning and public oversight. Then the operations are typically public. Again, the EU is mandating competition. So this is starting to change, but the competition, the ridership has risen, but not by that much compared with the rise of just building the initial system. And so I'm giving you the example of the French network. There's the Italian one, the Spanish one. There are a bunch of lines in Germany. The system in Germany is different. So the French system, you might be able to tell, is that in France it's based on contiguous high-speed lines between the major cities. So this is Paris. You have an all high-speed route to Lyon. Essentially, the only low-speed gaps there are going to be the last few kilometers into each city. There's also a bypass around Lyon for trains that go all the way to Marseille, and again, all high speed. There's a branch to Dijon. Dijon is small enough; it's not on a high speed line, so there is a low speed gap here. And same thing with again Lille, Strasbourg, Bordeaux, Nantes. I think actually the line to Nantes is the line to Nantes is an upgraded slow line. But from up to Le Mans, it's fast, and then it's fast to Rennes. So the point is that it's contiguous high-speed lines for hundreds of kilometers, and there's even the branch out to Brussels, which I will talk about in one sec because one of my points is about cross-border rail in Europe, and you can see the same paradigm used in Spain and in Italy. In Italy, starting from Torino, so Torino, Milano, Bologna, Firenze, Roma, Napoli, and all of this is fast. Now, the average speed in Italy is a lot lower than in France and in Spain, which is just because of the approaches. So, in France, they just bypass intermediate cities, so trains from Paris to Marseille don't stop at Lyon, or if they do, they only stop at the airport. In Italy, the problem is that if they have these bypasses are not fast. And a lot of these cities have terminus stations. So Milano, Firenze, and Roma. And this means that the trains... So first of all, the trains spend more time on approaches, and even if they are bypassing, like something like from Milano to Napoli, you're still wending around the suburbs of Rome at low speed. I don't think they pinch. I don't think they turn at Rome and then change direction the way that they do in Germany. But even then, I think the average speed is like 190 or 200 kilometers an hour. Just at here, it's 230, 240, 250. Germany is very different. Germany, we see some red lines here, red and orange being the high-speed colors. Yellow is almost always upgraded legacy lines. So in Germany, I live in Berlin, right? So from Berlin, if I'm trying to go to Köln, and I often am, there's this high-speed bit, but then a long legacy low-speed gap. And even the line here that says orange is supposed to be 250. Most of this is 200, not 250. There are some slowdowns here. So the train that I'm riding, if I go between Berlin and Köln, is going to be high-speed train capable of, I think, 330 kilometers an hour, but it is, but the lines almost never go above 200. So this is a medium speed system, and some of them are not even that fast, like around Bielefeld. And then Berlin to München, there are long parts where the train can do 300, but there are also long parts where it can't. By the way, this is not. No, actually, this is right. Sorry, so it's kind of weird. It's medium speed, then fast, slow, fast, and slow. To Frankfurt, there's this slow section from Erfurt to Frankfurt. Partly it's being planned to become high-speed rail, but this is, I think, for the 20s or early 30s. So there are high-speed lines in Germany, but again, they're usually shorter than in France, and not just because Germany is a physically smaller country than France, but also because the German paradigm is different. It's not based on high-speed, on contiguous high-speed. It's based on like little bypasses, of which the longest line, Hannover to Würzburg, first of all, doesn't pass through any significant cities other than Hannover. It passes through medium-sized cities. So that line connects Hannover city. It's a metro area of a little more than 1 million people, through Göttingen, Kassel, Fulda, and then to Würzburg. The idea is that then passengers can go from Hamburg or Bremen, or of course Hannover itself, which is not my thing, to points south, and then they're going to go at low speed from Fulda to Frankfurt, or from Würzburg to points south like München. And it's a really awkward alignment. This was also planned in the Cold War, and it kind of strategically is just west of the inner German border, because the main north-south line partly crossed the inner German border, so some of it is a Cold War relic. But even post-Cold War, Berlin to Munich, it's a post-Cold War plan. It's one of these projects designed to unify the country by building infrastructure to connect to the new capital, a partly East German city with noticeably lower average incomes than the core Western cities. And even then, again, it's they sped up parts of it, but the average speed is, because of all these gaps, not 190 or 200, let alone 250. It's, I think, the average speed on the fastest trains, the trains that don't pitch in Leipzig, is about 150, 160. And most trains do pitch at Leipzig. So, but it's still a solid network. Again, solid medium speed network. Unlike in France or Italy, or especially Spain, the trains run on a regular timetable. So shortly before France invented the TGV, Germany invented the intercity. And I have an old video about this, about I think I was talking about the various German inventions from the 1960s and 70s for modern public transport, which were the Takt, so the idea that the trains would all run on a regular timetable with timed connections, usually hourly. The Verkehrsverbund, it's called Transport Association in English, or Société de Transport in French, and the idea is that all of the operators in one region, I think the first one was Hamburg, so all the public transport operators in and around Hamburg would have fare integration between them, so they would plan so that, let's say, a monthly for the trains in Hamburg is valid on every single public transit vehicle in Hamburg. So it doesn't matter if it's the Hochbahn, which I think is municipal, the S-Bahn, which is Deutsche Bahn, or any of the other operators. There's a specific commuter rail operator that's separate from Hamburg. Like was in Berlin, on the same monthly ticket valid in the city, I can ride anything inside the city. So that's the other German invention. There's the Stadtbahn, which is kind of how to mix streetcars and subway service. So you put the streetcars in tunnels in city center and then have them branch on the surface. This is not a German invention. Boston and Philadelphia did it around 1900, but in Germany it's been used the most extensively. And then the intercity. Now, the intercity is a way of building medium speed rail. Again, this is from the 70s, so at the time, high speed rail existed, but only in Japan. Europe does not like learning from Asia, and essentially the vector in Europe for learning from Asia is mostly France learning from Japan, or at least was at the time, France learning from Japan. Very similar kind of elite mentalities, I think. And so in Germany, the concept of the intercity is that it's planned around a takt. So the trains run every hour or every 2 hours between major cities, and the thicker lines would be hourly or even more than, or even better than hourly nowadays. And the transfers are timed. So let's say the train from, so, and I'm making things up because I don't remember the old intercity network. So let's say you have a train from Hamburg to Stuttgart, and then from Köln to Basel, and somehow these trains would connect in Frankfurt. So you could switch between them, and you would have a short transfer window. And this was perfected in Switzerland, where they also figured that they can start building infrastructure to reinforce this national tact so that trains would connect major nodes in less than an hour. So this is a different way of running trains from the French way. It is generally superior at shorter distances and inferior at longer distances, which is why I'm sad that Germany's copying only Switzerland. The Swiss system is, to be clear, the best in Europe. But the issue with the connectivity and the frequency is that the impact of frequency is higher when the trips are shorter. You know how it's annoying when your subway only runs every 15 minutes, right? Well, that's because you're traveling within the city. It's a short trip. If your intercity trains are every 15 minutes to show up and go, because the trip is probably 3 or 4 hours. And it's the same kind of principle. So the French frequency is a couple trains per day. Clermont-Ferrand, I randomly checked, this is not even a TGV. So Clermont-Ferrand is 7 round trips to Paris each day. And it's a couple hours, so 7 round trips. I mean, yeah, ideally it should be better than that, but the impact is not going to be huge. And of course, Clermont-Ferrand is kind of small. But for example, Lyon is, I think, mostly hourly off peak, so maybe half hourly part of is half hourly to hourly. It's not, France does not have a dedicated arc, just a very busy line. And again, that's if the train is 2 or 3 hours, then hourly even is okay. And if it's longer, then even less than that is okay. And then the average speed is more, and then high average speed is more important for longer trips. So Germany is at this point, I think. So as I said, so Germany overtook France in intercity rail trips. Not yet per capita, but I imagine that will happen very shortly, just with the trends. But the average trip length in Germany is much shorter, essentially because those timed connections are really good for short trips, because the weight is proportionally more important. So that would be essentially for trips of the style of Berlin to Munich, the French system would be superior to the French one. The French system would be superior to the German one. For trips like, I don't know, Magdeburg to, I don't know, Würzburg or something. These are random. They're probably not very connected relative to the network. So let's, I don't know. So something like, let's say, Lübeck to Fulda, the German system would be better. So again, it's a trade-off. And of course you can combine and do both. But the point is that Germany has a different paradigm and it works in a German context. Could it work better? Yeah, sure. The French one could also work better. Essentially, France and Germany need to learn from each other. But they have pretty good intercity rail networks. And again, I would like people to look very closely at this map and note that, and try to count how many lines that have a color cross national borders. Look, in France, yeah, technically this crosses a national border from Barcelona to Perpignan. But France hasn't even bothered connecting to Perpignan, even though Perpignan is on the French side of the... So this is a long tunnel from Figueres to Perpignan. Very little service because Perpignan and Figueres, you probably have not heard of them except in contact, except if you're except if you're excited about this tunnel opening in the 2000s, because the point is not to get to Perpignan, is to get from Barcelona to Marseille to Lyon to Paris, and this is still a low speed gap. France is lazy about building this. From Bordeaux, there are plans to extend this to Toulouse and even here to Dax, but crossing the border and getting to Bilbao and then here to Madrid, that's not really on the plan. That's not really being planned. Now, across the mountains here, that is being planned. This is a base tunnel that's a generational project with all of the criticisms that entails. That is being done. Trains to Switzerland, it's all low speed gaps. It's just the high speed lines pass close enough that the average speed is still okay. I think Paris to Genève is like 3 hours, maybe 3.5 hours, or Paris to Basel, or to Zurich even. But it's just because of the inter-French trains. Now, the one place where it's fast is to Brussels. Now, within Belgium, it's not very clear, and maybe I should do a different map for that then. High-speed rail in Belgium maybe might be better for that. But the point is that in Belgium, the lines are designed around the line. Okay, this is a Belgium map. So the trains are actually fast to Paris, but there are low speed gaps in all of their directions. If you're trying to go to the Netherlands, there's this long low speed gap to Antwerpen. So the average speed from Brussels to Amsterdam is rather low. I mean, not low, but you still would probably connect between them by train. It's again these are two small countries, so maybe high average speed is not that important unless you're going to Paris. And then why would Belgium care about fast trips between France and the Netherlands? Belgium's domestic priorities are different, but it does lead to but it does mean that, for example, the average speeds within Belgium are low. So the again, except for Paris. So the situation of cross-border rail in Europe is that it's just slow. The high-speed lines don't really do it, with the exception of Paris to Brussels to London, run by Thalys and Eurostar, and these in turn don't have the social mission of SNCF or Deutsche Bahn. They horrifically overcharge. I believe on both, the average ticket price is about twice as high as for an equivalent length of trip in France or in Germany domestically. Essentially, they're just aiming at the business traveler market. Maybe the idea is that they shouldn't be subsidizing foreigners or foreign travel, but the TGV system is profitable. SNCF used to be profitable thanks to the TGV until about 10 years ago, when the cheminots realized that, wait, if SNCF is profitable, they can demand higher pay and benefits, and expect some subsidies to be politically acceptable in between, and at the same time SNCF was doing some low-cost airline experiments that didn't really succeed, so revenue fell. Deutsche Bahn's intercity rail network is profitable. You can make profit with charging 10 or 11 euro cents per kilometer. That's fine. You don't need to charge the 19 or 20 that are being charged on Thalys or Eurostar. And so the cross-border. So the point is that the high-speed rail networks that we have here are national. Now, the EU is interested in improving infrastructure within the EU, and this also used to include Britain until very recently. And I don't think there have even been substantial changes to planning post-Brexit, because the maximum time for let's call it for the pizzazz of high-speed rail was in the 2000s, because at the time the TGV network were still growing. And after the Great Recession, there have been changes. First of all, France is just people aren't trying to be France anymore. Partly it's that the Spanish network, which was kind of the most aggressively built, has pitiful ridership. Partly it's austerity. So the but some of these plans predate that. So anyway, there are these planned lines that are essentially lines on a map called 10T. And I did mention at the end of last video, and I'm going to repeat what I said about something like the Magistral for Europe, which is there are these plans that are international, but the EU isn't really building that. So you'd expect that under a build not, and this is the difference between building and notching. Building would mean that the EU would coordinate the various countries in on this system. These countries being France, but France doesn't need any changes. This is already built. So this would really mean Germany and Austria, and then Wien to Bratislava. I guess you can also count Hungary and Slovakia, but these are very peripheral to the system. What really is the important bit is Paris to Vienna. Bratislava again being smaller, Budapest being smaller, and also frankly run by Ruckers. And so the upshot is that the EU is not doing that because the EU nudges. So what the EU will do is it will draw lines on a map and then expect others to build on them. It will not get its own funding. The idea that the EU spends money used to be anathema, and then it changed in 2020 with the Corona package. So the EU did start doing a little bit of fiscal federalism without calling it fiscal federalism, so that people in Northern Europe wouldn't feel like they're subsidizing Southern and Eastern Europe. But they still spent 750 billion euros in a package on Corona and relief, and that included infrastructure. So you'd expect that with a lot of infrastructure being funded, it's called the Green Deal in Europe. It's named after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. Nobody calls it Green New Deal in Europe. The European term for it is Green Deal, which again is mostly just funding infrastructure. But they're not actually funding this line. They're not saying, okay, let's work with Germany to make sure that that Germany actually builds this and that Austria actually builds this. No. It's like there might be some. It's never that obtrusive. Instead, when the EU tries to think about how to improve the rail network, it's kind of hating the idea of having a government. It's all about trying to privatize, requiring competition on the rails. So you're, as a state-owned railway in a European country, required to give slots at whatever the usual track access fees to a private competitor that's going to wreck your tact. This is not how Switzerland works. Switzerland not being part of this mandate. The fact that Switzerland, one of the most capitalistic countries in Western Europe, I think it's the only one actually, other than the UK and maybe Ireland and now Greece, not to have sectoral collective bargaining. I think it also has the most privatized healthcare system in the democratic first world outside the United States. That country, doesn't do that because they are happy with their state-built and state-operated system. They have tax. They have Verkehrsverbünde for where when they have private operators, they own their own track and run on their own track and have agreements to coordinate fares and the timetable. It's not like Flixtrain trying to pick its own schedules and its own trains. It's not trying to imitate the failed British experiment with privatizing the railway. So Switzerland, a highly decentralized federal state, still does things. The EU doesn't do it. Nudges, again, the idea is how to maybe incentivize private operators to do the thing, but you can't incentivize them to build infrastructure. That is only done by the state. And they don't really have the ability. They have the ability. They don't really have the will to actually build things. And this cascades to the level of activism, to the point that there is a lot of cross-border rail activism in Europe. A lot of people trying to make this better at the national and EU-wide level. They're trying to look at things like night trains, anything to avoid building infrastructure because they've decided that they can't build infrastructure. Sometimes they can't. Often they can. I've heard Germans say that Germany can build infrastructure, just doesn't want to. So a lot of it is just, again, trying to nudge things rather than actively doing. You do not get infrastructure by nudge. And once the government comes up with the idea that you only nudge rather than doing, then yeah, I mean, people trying to influence it will talk in terms about how to nudge things and how to set up incentives, and somehow they will never build things. Now, if you never build, people then don't associate the state with a helping hand that actually does things for them, because it doesn't. Or if it does, it is afraid of itself and therefore will not tell them, hi, this is a government-built project. Maybe they will put a sign, but nobody will believe that sign. Then people will distrust the state, and the state will react by trying to shrink further. And now I was talking before about army and Ukraine level issues. This is the polling on an EU army. I will never tire of reminding every single Euro of this, that in nearly every EU member, there is a majority, often a solid majority, in favor of such a thing. Remember, this is not quite out of 100 because there are a lot of don't-knows. So don't think of Poland as 57-43. There's a slightly older poll by Eurobarometer that they scrubbed from the internet because it was being used in the Brexit press as, oh my god, there's going to be an EU army, because there's polling saying it's 55-39, I believe, EU-wide, 57-37, I believe, if you exclude the UK. This was while Brexit was happening, but before the formal date of departure. I think it was 2018. And so Eurobarometer just scrubbed and said there's not going to be an EU army. This is, again, something that the majority of Europeans support. It's a majority it's not just a majority in the sense that, let's say, everyone in France and Germany, and then the Poles don't trust them. This is Poland. Or maybe people in Southern Europe are more skeptical. This is Spain. And even in Greece, where it's in decline, look at Greece. And again, Italy is supposed to be 50, but it's not 50 out of 100 because there are don't-knows. So it's something that's popular. It's something that, in theory, is in the European People's Party's platform. It's something that Macron was trying to do, and yet nobody thinks it can even happen because it's and they keep saying no, we will not do it on something that is, again, popular, because it involves the EU doing things, and essentially the Eurocrats don't do, they not. And this, again, is true even on, let's say, young European federalists. So you'd expect that these are people who would talk about that because you're European federalists. You're supposed to want this. Here's what they're saying about Ukraine. Press statements about Ukraine. The EU strategy on Ukraine should be built on three main pillars: peace, enlargement, reform. Peace for... I should not be doing this right now. You see the time, 7:49. You might be able to also tell as the lighting, especially as I'm getting backlit whenever I'm watching a white screen like I am right now. But if I'm not, you see, current time, sunset time. Let's watch something less white, like this. And I'm actually going to, the sun is setting. I should not be reading things that put me to sleep right now, okay? I should try to read I should, deal with the soporifics, around noon. Maybe if it's, midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning and I need to sleep and I can't fall asleep, that would be a really good thing. I should bring this to bed with me to make sure that I sleep at a reasonable time tonight. But this is just, look at this. This is not, this is what every boomer wishes every zoomer were. And the same thing, by the way, that they said about Corona in 2020. I was reading this, and essentially at no point were they talking about how, EU action could do this. They were saying that, again, the most boring things ever because if the state nudges, then the people who lobby that state at that level also talk in pure nudge terms. It's I keep complaining about Washingtonian in the United States. In Europe, it's Brussels. It's the equivalent for Brussels. I don't know what the demonym for someone for Brussels is. Let me check. And this is something that means that you're never going to get infrastructure if the top people only nudge rather than doing. Now in Europe, the way this Brusselian. Okay, I don't speak Brusselian. Is my point. Now you can have nudgers with the understanding that they don't do anything. Again, in Europe we have nudgers, but you also have doers at the member state level. And then there's the United States. The United States is run by nudgers. Again, people who are not as terrible as the Eurocrats. Washingtonian is a weird language, but it is closer to normal English than Brusselian is. And I don't just mean that in Brusselian people use Euro English like homologation as if normal people use that word. No, I mean that in Washingtonian, and I've been talking to, let's say, and I've been briefing federal officials, and they do use a lot of random acronyms they usually associate with military people speaking in what are practically codes, but beyond that, they actually speak in fairly concrete policy terms. Up to a limit. I mean, I will never tire of talking about this person who was asked about bus shelter a couple of years ago and answered with something incomprehensible about creating standards for transit stations, as opposed to saying, yes, we will, this sounds good. How much money do you think is appropriate for this in an infrastructure bill? Okay, 500 million, 1 billion, let's do 1 billion to make every bus stop in America have shelter or something like that. It's never that. So that example, that latter example, would be doing, and this is what this person did not do, because the feds in America still mostly nudge. I'm just pointing out that their nudge rather than do problem is less bad than that of the EU. However, there is something that is much worse in the United States than in Europe, which is in Europe, yeah, the EU does not do things, but the member states do, and in the United States, the states don't do it either. The states, so part of it is the United States has very high mobility between the states. So there's an American identity, which is stronger than the EU identity. The EU is slowly trying to build it, to build such an identity. Clearly, younger people have this identity. This is where you're seeing things, again, EU Army. But people still don't move as much between member states because of issues like language, credentials, social networks themselves don't move as much yet. The people who do move, because it's like in industries that usually just use English as the business language, there's a lot of lack of assimilation involved. So these are people who are just much less politically empowered. Not only does nobody ask the Berlin tech workers what they think about housing issues, but often it's viewed like their utility is viewed with a negative sign in front of it. It's somehow even worse than in San Francisco, where people are when people used to not care at all about the housing issues of recent domestic or international migrants, but eventually they did manage to insinuate themselves into city social networks. And I mean, evidently the most popular San Francisco politician in San Francisco, Scott Wiener, constantly tries to pass YIMBY bills. Some of them even pass the state lodge. In Berlin, yeah, there's YIMBYism, but there are politicians who are YIMBY. I mean, pretty sure most Berliners want things to be YIMBY, but somehow that never happens. So and in the United States, it's not that there's way more moving. Like, it's not considered inappropriate for someone to move between parts of the United States. Certainly, you don't need to learn a new language. It's completely normal for even a political leader to not be a born resident of the city. I think Eric Adams is from New York, but I believe both Bill de Blasio and Mike Bloomberg grew up in Boston. and a lot of it, and there's like a growing nationalization of the press, for example, and of politics. So this also means that anywhere which is safe for a party in federal elections, there's just not going to be a lot of Democratic Party choice at the state level, let alone at the local level, and which is again very much not a certainly like I mean, you can maybe figure out that like on a lot of issues Germany is well to the left of I don't know Poland, and so but it's not like this means that like Poland has an equivalent of CDU that wins every election with super majorities because Poland is that conservative, and Germany has an equivalent of like the Polish opposition and they also win super majorities because Germany is that liberal and social. No, in Germany instead, like there's like an actual recognizable left, and then in Poland it's a small thing, and instead there's a I don't know whether to call peace extreme right. Peace is in most ways extreme right, but Poland then has peace instead. Essentially, the parties adjust to competitive elections at the national scale. They don't do that in American states. The agenda, like at no point do, let's say, the Republicans in New York try to make their agenda palatable to the media in New York. And in New York, it's at least close to that. Like in the Northeast, there is that tradition of moderate Republicans who were like not as religiously conservative. They might be racist, like on tough on crime issues, especially in New York. They're very fiscally conservative. But for example, they're not going to join anti-gay moral panics, or and they're going to broadcast moderation on abortion, for example, but it's a specifically northeastern tradition, and it's dying anyway. And then in California, for example, the Republican when Governor Newsom was in was caught in a scandal, he ate indoors at a fancy restaurant called French Laundry with a donor. Shortly after signing an indoor dining ban, the Republicans, and there was a recall effort, and the Republicans did not try to find someone who would be palatable to the median Californian. There was such a Republican, his name was Kevin Faulconer. He was the mayor of San Diego and a self-described YIMBY. Instead of trying to rally around a moderate Republican who will get the support of a lot of moderates in San Francisco by talking about, by being anti-NIMBY, or at least anti-liberal city NIMBY, maybe such a person would be able to support various rural NIMBYs or suburban NIMBYs in the Central Valley or something. That's not actually too hard. And run on a kind of good government campaign complaining about like actual corruption. And talking about school quality rather than about corona denialism or something, but they didn't do that. To the contrary, the main Republican opponent was a total whack job, and conversely, every single Democrat fell on themselves saying that no, it's not actually bad for the governor to flagrantly eat indoors right after signing an indoor dining ban and act like it wasn't even a scandal. And Newsom ended up winning the recall by slightly wider margin than he won his first election. And so because of that, there's no political competition. So bear in mind, it doesn't mean the government can't do it. The government can do without political competition. It'll just be corrupt. It's just I'm motivating the point that the American states are one country, really, and the EU member states are not. And what this means is that, first of all, they take their cues from the federal government much more so than member states will take their cue from something that's not even really a country yet. And the second thing is they have way less fiscal capacity. So they're constantly worried about their ability to borrow, their ability to spend long term, so they never make long-term spending plans. and um, and third, they're mired in this ideology of privatizing the state. It's a very Anglo neoliberal kind of Thatcherite, post-Thatcherite ideology, which hasn't really hit German or French neoliberalism. There are some examples of this, like like with how Grand Paris Express is being run, but there's no sign of privatization of SNCF, for example. Deutsche Bahn, there was a time in which they were trying to privatize, to make it privatization ready, leading to deferred maintenance with all the problems that resulted in. The person who was in charge at the time, Medon, subsequently served NATO loyally, if inadvertently, by giving his best advice to the Russian railways. Unfortunately, he resigned from the board shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, rather than continuing to serve NATO by giving his best advice to Werjede. So the like it's kind of the ideology that the state is always bad, and the problem is that the EU, because the EU was basically a free trade zone with some harmonization of regulations during the era when there was this big expansion of the government qua something that does, which was middle of the 20th century. A lot of the EU institutions or things are more recent, and this makes them more kind of anti-government. I don't want to say neoliberal because again, Macron is the most neoliberal politician in Europe, and he doesn't really do it. He's constantly criticized for doing it, for bringing in consultants, but SNCF's problem is not over-reliance on consultants. And this is, by the way, something that's not purely European. It's something that also I have this constant explanation for construction costs in democratic Asia. I'm contrasting South Korea and Taiwan. The costs in South Korea were historically some of the lowest in the world. Yes, I wouldn't say 2 centuries. I would say 1 century, because in the United States, the date we're talking about is, I don't remember the date that the Confederacy surrendered. So, sometime in 1865, and in the EU and in Europe, it's specifically our date of civilization is the 8th of May 45. And as soon as that happened, several things happened, and I'm gonna turn on the light, so I'm gonna go off camera for a few seconds. When I stream in December, it never happens, because when I stream in December, it's dark well before I start streaming. When I stream in June, it stays it stays well lit until after I'm done. But in March, April, I need to do this midstream, and I'm sorry. Or remember to do this pre-stream. So remember that George Orwell was talking about a United States of Europe. Churchill was talking about a United States of Europe. Basically, as soon as the war ended, Europe was hit by multiple shocks at once from the war. One of the shocks was there's our civilization, which we believed was the pinnacle of world culture, actually gassed the Jews. Can we not talk about? Actually, we might need to talk about this, but can we not? But can those Jews stop whining about it too much? This was kind of the mentality in the 40s, but over time it was the understanding that Europe literally did this, which provided space for a lot of self-criticism and a lot of critique of nationalism. Another shock was the fact that the large European state, by which I mean Germany, France, Italy, Britain, was no longer a main geopolitical unit. Was the understanding that this was the world of giant continental superstates, that is to say the United States and the Soviet Union. The third one was that suddenly the conflict was transitioning from national conflict to ideological conflict. This was something that after the Cold War was believed to no longer be the case. For example, Huntingtonian ideas of civilization don't have that at all. However, Huntington was wrong, and the conflict is starting to acquire more ideological characteristics. It's just not capitalism versus communism. It's democracy versus authoritarianism. Authoritarianism being almost entirely of the more right-wing rather than the more left-wing variety, which breaks people's brains because the center-right has always believed itself to be the most loyal, patriotic thing ever, and then for the most part, when you see disloyalty to NATO, you see it from the right and not from the left, which does not mean that alt-left parties don't support Putin. They do. It's just that they're not relevant, whereas the head of the German Navy obviously was a relevant figure while he was the head of the German Navy until very shortly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So with all of these shocks combined, there was this kind of idea that, wait, the various European states need to join together and have something at the same scale as the United States. And this is something that you literally see the expression United States of Europe from within Britain in the 1940s, shortly after the war. So that is essentially the shock that created this. And of course, a lot of the friction since then has been, wait, if we're in a bigger country, maybe sometimes we need to compromise. But we thought we were the best and everyone would just bow down to us, EU. This is essentially the Brexit mentality. And the Polish mentality that leads them to, in a country where, again, a large majority of the population wants an EU army, talk about how the EU has been useless and essentially complain incessantly about things that France and Germany are doing, that they're not supportive enough of Ukraine. And then when the United States is literally the exact same thing, Poland basically licks the Americans' boots. And of course, in France and Germany, they have their own petty concerns. And so, but the point is that the EU, the idea for it goes back to right after the war, but the actual characteristic of the state is from the 90s. The European Union is from, I think, 92. Before then was the European Community. The increases in mobility are literally from the last generation. And what this means is that it's based on ideas from the 1990s of how to run the government, hence not quite Thatcherism. The high inequality aspects of Thatcherism were just not there. And I'm going to point out that when we talk about Thatcherism, probably the most important thing to highlight is that is the inequality aspect of it. So the US, for example, people keep talking about how America has become more unequal. The US had a Gini index of 0.32 in before Reagan, and then after Reagan it was 3.5, and then there was an increase under Clinton Bush, and then at the peak it was 0.39. It actually fell a bit during Carter to 0.37. So from 0.32 to 0.37, like 5.5 points of increase. And in the UK, it was the UK in the 60s and 70s had the same inequality as the Nordic countries do today. Maggie took 0.25 and left it at 0.33. And then there has been essentially, for the most part, stability. It's like back to, I guess, 0.31, but it's a much bigger increase. And so that is Thatcherism. And so that aspect has not really been part of it. But the part where the state should not be running things, it should be doing public-private partnership. The action should be by the private sector. The state's job is to provide the right incentives. It's a lot of it is people who, instead of actually doing things, again, this is where I talk about government by nudge. It's people who read, let's say, Parkinson, from Parkinson's law. It's people who are trying to make themselves kind of meta experts or experts on experts rather than experts on one thing. They keep saying things like experts are siloed, experts are have the wrong interests. Essentially, it's this kind of idea that the elites don't trust the professionals, so instead they're going to try to speak over the professionals and again talk about and then ask and try to ask questions to gauge how confident you are rather than question rather than any kind of subject matter expertise. And this is something I constantly see when I talk to generalist American and British people. And by the way, at international organizations, even people who have never been American or British act the exact same way. It's just that public transport in Berlin is influenced by trends in Berlin and in Germany. It's not really influenced by trends at, I don't know, UITP or anything like that, or the EU. It's just not relevant. And so because the EU, like the EU state is from the 90s, 2000s, it's a different mentality. And this actually matters. So construction costs, as a reminder, so this is my database, and by my, I mean a database that I've contributed some things to, but I'm not at all even the plurality contributor to. I might actually be the plurality contributor to in number of distinct countries that were put in, not a number of distinct projects, because China has just so many. I'm by far plurality, probably my majority in distinct sources. Like if we're talking like one source that has like a list of things, I would count it, even if it's different links, I would count it as one source for this, for like worked on. So this is, you see, this is the same thing. It's different projects. This is the same source. So it's just different segments, and you always want more rather than less data. But the point is that on this database, you can see the actual way you query it is transitcosts.com, and then you follow links from there. I have not complete, but pretty good data from Taiwan. Taiwan is plausibly the most expensive place to build in the world. That is a democracy where the main language is not English, like a stable democracy where the main language is not English. And South Korea is the cheapest in Asia. I can't tell their construction costs nowadays because it's because my data on South Korea is very incomplete for recent stuff. Actually, I have more complete data from like the 70s, 80s, 90s, and they were very cheap then. I've found some really cheap things from the 2010s, but maybe there's been a big increase. I'm not sure. But certainly the South Korea by like 15 years ago or something like that was the cheapest place to build in all of Asia, comparable to Southern Europe or pre-2010s Scandinavia. And this despite the fact that the political and economic histories of Taiwan and South Korea are extremely similar. And essentially the difference between these two countries is when they started building subways, South Korea being bigger than Taiwan, Seoul being bigger than Taipei. South Korea started building earlier in the 1970s, Taiwan did in the 90s. This meant two things. The first is in the 1990s, when the Taipei MRT was being planned, was already new right. So there was more of an ideology of privatization. Now, in this case, I think it's a secondary explanation. The primary is that South Korea in the 70s looked like a stable dictatorship, a stable right-wing military dictatorship. Now it wasn't actually stable because within a few years the president would be assassinated, and then there would be the protests that would force reforms, and then conservatives would win democratic elections through vote splitting, and then in 97 an actual liberal won the election and did a lot of political reforms and economic reforms, that is to say stopping subsidizing big businesses. And in Taiwan, that history is fairly similar, actually. The protests were in the 80s, and then democratization is, I think, 87. Same, I think the first I think it's 87 in both Taiwan and South Korea, and then in South Korea, the opposition actually wins in 97, and in Taiwan, I think in 96. The difference is that this means that the Taipei MRT was being planned at a time of political instability when the KMT was in charge, but already foresaw the date would not be in charge. So that led to corruption, because it meant that the party needed to park party money somewhere without letting the opposition, the filthy opposition, get its hands on things that the KMT saw as its by right. The South Korean conservatives aren't any different, by the way. It's just that it's just that in the 70s they felt more secure, so there was less. So they weren't literally trying to overspend on infrastructure just to reward cronies. So even then, but the timing matters. Where if you started in the 90s, you're going to be more expensive, not because of issues of experience, but just because by the 1990s, it's considered more normal to rely on consultants to, again, privatize. Hi, Kaleidosium. So this is the problem. So the problem is that at the EU level, by the time the EU formed, nudge became the dominant ideology. Now, in the United States, nudge became the dominant ideology, but the United States, besides the fact that its inequality was already very high in the 60s and 70s, again, 0.32, which is higher than basically every modern non-Anglo rich country today. Like, I mean, okay, Spain is about the same. But Spain, like Southern Europe, has pretty high inequality. Like there's a lot of welfare, but the welfare is mistargeted. Norway, for example, is 0.26. And yeah, it's an increase from the 70s. But the point is that Norway today is substantially less unequal than the United States ever was. The Netherlands, somehow you literally can't see you literally can't see Wim Kok or Mark Rutte anywhere in this. Like the Netherlands, yeah, I guess inequality rose in the 80s, but this is the inequality in the Netherlands since like the last 30 years. Again, lower, and this is a country that privatized its national healthcare system in the early 2010s. Again, Mark Rutte. Or let's say Germany. In Germany, we do see an increase in inequality. So it was 2.27, and one point was 2.6, or maybe even 2.5. It's about 0.3 for which, and the big increase was not even under Merkel; it was under Schröder. So Schröder is from here to here. So we see an increase to less inequality than the US ever had. And the point is that in Britain, it's very different. Britain did not, like, Britain in the 70s was an egalitarian society. Where the egalitarianism involved extraordinarily high taxes on high incomes, which pissed off the upper middle class, and therefore they vote, or like Britain, I guess they call themselves middle class. So they voted Maggie, and Maggie transferred income upward. And by the same token, Britain had a much more intact, much more active state in the 60s, 70s, even 80s. Oh, yeah. It has private healthcare. Yeah, that's the point. By the way, in Germany, healthcare is semi-private. Like it's, there's the public Kasse system. There are non-profit-ish private providers. But in the Netherlands, but the point is that the Netherlands privatized a pre-existing public system. Because again, Mark Rutte. And with that, you literally can't see that in its inequality statistics. And so the point is that in the same way that Britain had an egalitarian society and a strong welfare system for Margaret Thatcher to dismantle, it also had a very strong tradition of state planning for Margaret Thatcher to dismantle. A state planning system that was restored in London because the attempt to privatize the underground was such a disaster that TfL was formed with very strong he has access to the Kasse, but if he wants to, it's just you still need to pay premiums for healthcare, it turns out. Or you can get, or certainly you can get private for like not very high premiums. But the point is, but the point is that TfL, it was understood so quickly that the privatization attempt was failing that they reformed it as a very strong in-house team. TfL, therefore, has very strong in-house planning for operations. The NHS. What do you mean it's a money pit? Like Britain does not have high healthcare. Does not have high healthcare costs. Um, um, I am very impressed by the fact that I managed to not have too many typos. Okay, so this is, by the way, something that is This is America bad. This is not Anglo bad. This is America bad. America, and where will we find Australia? So this would be, I guess, Norway and Luxembourg, right? Norway and Luxembourg. No, Ireland. Ireland is just weird. Remember, Irish GDP per capita is fake news because it includes corporate profits of companies where the legal HQs are in Dublin, so that by American standards they count as not American and they don't owe global taxes, but management sits in the United States. So by Irish standards, they're not counted as domiciled in Ireland and they don't owe global taxes in Ireland either. So the GDP per capita in Ireland is just hogwash. In Norway, it's real. Norway's just rich because of wine. So Germany is actually the expensive one. Austria, Sweden, Iceland, Canada. You see that Britain does not actually have very high healthcare costs like Britain and Canada. Now there are quality problems. Essentially, Britain and I would not recommend that American healthcare reform follow the Canadian or British model. These are early examples of universal health, especially Britain, because the NHS is from right after the war. It's from Attlee. So at the time, the working class just did not really have regular access to healthcare. And when you're doing healthcare reform in a country where most people already have semi-decent private insurance, you need to do something more complex. France would actually have been a good model for Obamacare, having done universal healthcare under Jospin in 2000. Something that you also can't see in French inequality statistics, but you can see it in French health outcome statistics. And as I never tire of reminding everyone, for Jospin's success in bringing universal healthcare to France, he was rewarded by the radical left with so much third-party vote that he came in third in the first round of the presidential election in 2002, an election where the polls predicted that he would eke out a victory over Chirac in the second round. He never made it to the second round. Jean-Marie Le Pen did, which was the start of a long path of mainstreaming of the National Front. Thank you, French alt-left. Now disappear. So, but anyway, this is, again, healthcare is not America bad. Sorry, it is America bad. It's not Anglo bad. And essentially the issue is that the NHS, so again, the British state does things like the NHS. It's literally it's a literal public system. It's not even single payer like Canada. And people in Britain, so they see that they have healthcare. Part of it is being averse to change. This keeps Britain probably more public than the preference of the median Briton on like economic left-right issues would have produced in equilibrium today. Like just as in the United States, the status quo produces a more right-wing, like a more privatized system than the median American would support in in a vacuum today. But also, British people speak favorably of their own NHS. They see it give them healthcare, and therefore the Tories understood that they can't really privatize it. They can maybe shape it a little bit, try to do things like charge for parking, which apparently Jeremy Corbyn especially considers to be a violation of the rule of free healthcare. But they're not privatizing the system. They can't. Because again, this is something that does rather than nudges. But with infrastructure, this was all privatized to consultants who went to Singapore and Hong Kong and liked being treated as kings, liked how the private sector that reigned supreme, liked the very high inequality of these places, and that they brought it back home. And now the point is that Britain lost its ability to build in that process. Construction costs in London went up by a factor of somewhere between 3 and 4 between the 70s and the 2000s. And in and again, in operations, it didn't happen because it was so obviously a disaster that TfL was formed as a public agency with a very strong in-house staff in operations. So, okay, medical residents just, yeah, I mean, so a lot of it is like medical residents being underpaid, sure, but in the mid 2000s at least, um, like I think Ezra Klein posted some statistics back when he was like a rising star, or not like an already establishment figure. Um, British doctors at the time, on average, made almost as much as American doctors. Like that's not the difference. Like French doctors, yeah, they make a lot less, but British doctors, I think it was like they made maybe 2/3 as much as American doctors. Um, I think this might have actually been. I think it was gross salary, and Britain would have had higher like payroll taxes. Um, like that's not the difference. Yeah, this is something that this is specifically a rich country issue. Healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP. So healthcare spending, I don't know what the opposite of degressive is, but healthcare spending grows faster than GDP. I think it's population aging, although I don't think, for example, China has atypically high healthcare spending. Um, Yeah, sure. Okay, but I mean, there's a difference. Okay, I mean, okay, so charge for parking, but remember that in the United States, your insurance, like the system of insurance, is that they keep sending you bills and expect you to spend hours of your time calling billing departments to dispute the bills. Like, there's a lot of like that kind of bureaucratic, hostile environment in the American system that is invisible outside the United States, um, and also invisible to Americans who don't use healthcare. Um, but anyway, the issue is that um, TFL does operations very well. I keep saying I keep saying Anglosphere bad on infrastructure, but that's construction. In operations, it's not like that at all. And actually, TFL is a very good model to learn operations from for a peer Anglo agency, for which I mostly mean New York, because the because Toronto is also pretty good at operations, uh, and uh, and I think so is Sydney, but I'm not sure. And a lot of it is essentially stuff like how to maximize the amount of human mass you can put on a very space constrained train system. So they have very good signaling and very good throughput in London. They've had to do it because their trains are infamously tiny and cramped. Their platforms are tiny and cramped. They can't, remember, London cannot build. London wants to build. It's very clear they want to build, but it can't, and therefore it needs to maximize the system that it currently has. In the same way that where do you see places that can turn 14 high-speed trains an hour on 4 tracks? You don't see it in Paris, not because the Parisians are bad at operations, but because let's do a little Google Earth tour. I'm pretty sure it's visible from like satellite view. Of Gare du Nord or Gare de Lyon. You see how many fucking tracks there are here? And yeah, a lot of it is regional trains, and not just TGVs, but remember that the commuter trains are already underground here. They have 4 tracks underground. That's all they need because they're RERs. And yeah, there's also there's also a bunch of legacy Transilien network, but that's like the equivalent. I think that's 16 peak trains an hour, maybe 20. So that's not like 80. Um, it's like less than, let's say, LAR into Penn Station, and a station that has more tracks. Or Gare de Lyon has a lot less. I think Gare de Lyon is like 4 trains an hour worth of Transilien at the peak, because else has been just folded into the RER, which is not occupying station tracks. Look at how much station space there is. Of course, the trains are going to take forever to turn. They don't need to be any more efficient than this. I mean, ideally they should, because gathering dust instead of earning very high revenue if they're not running. But there's space. And if they had more space, then it would be used probably for lower price trains. So SNCF is lazy about this and doesn't care. Again, SNCF has problems. This is the size of Gare de Lyon. Now, Tokyo Station, for trains going from the north, has 4 tracks. Yeah, they need to turn 14 trains per hour. They will figure out how to do it. My critique of High Speed 2 is that they haven't figured out that it's possible to do it when you need to. So instead, they are cutting trains off from Euston. And likewise, TfL has a train every minute 40-second at rush hour on the Vic. A little less frequent, but only a little on annoyingly branched lines like the Central. This is with a lot of random constraints, a lot of I don't remember if the junctions on the Central line are flat or flying. I imagine that you can't do that with flat junctions, probably flying, but it's still aligned with branches. And these are not driverless lines. So they're doing impressive things with operations at TfL because they have to. And remember, TfL is the government that does. They don't nudge. Their biggest problem is that they're good enough at what they do, and London is so big and rich that they feel like learning from non-Anglo places is beneath their notice. And because they're by far the biggest and best Anglo agency, it means they don't learn from anyone. There's a difference between the state refuses to learn, like London, Paris, also New York, and the state has been privatized. So this is an example of doing successfully. Now, in the United States, again, there was less of a government to privatize. This was still done. The issue is that the United States was already the United States always had a much more politicized state, much more politicized civil service, much more reliance on an overclass of political appointees. There were already thousands in the 50s. Now, bear in mind, New York had 1,000 people for the professional, I think it was the public commission, the Public Utilities Commission. So people who were building rapid transit, designing and engineering rapid transit, but also sewers and other public infrastructure. I think 1915, Eric told me, I think either yesterday or the day before yesterday, I actually talked to him about the do versus nudge issue, because as I said, we're talking to federal people, and one of the things I'm pointing out to them is that they need to stop nudging and actually doing. And Eric pointed out to me that he looked at one point and found that in 1915, New York had 1,000 people working for the public sector infrastructure agency, which I don't remember the name of. There was something called the Rapid Transit Commission, but I think the Rapid Transit Commission was one part of that agency. And so so that was the system. So that was the doing municipal, maybe state government system that could do things, but again, they lost their ability to do by, I guess, federal inspiration, maybe is the best way to describe it, or just maybe they didn't grow. But I don't know the history of how New York got from 1915 to today. The IND construction cost blowout in the 30s was something very different. It was populism. It was not privatization of the state. And the privatization was actually in the 2000s. New York lost its ability to build before privatization. This is not the only thing that makes you incapable of building. And it's specifically not the issue in New York. New York lost its ability to build, and then it transitioned to nudging and lost its ability and lost the vestiges of its ability to build. But the New York City of the 1970s, 80s, 90s could not build either. Very much unlike the London of the 70s, for example. And so the nudging in this, so I keep talking about privatization, but privatization, the issue is not just privatization. You can privatize but still have the ability to do things yourself. This is the attempt to, maybe I should call it a cope, but this is the Nordic attempt to square the fact that, wait, we're Nordics. We trust our own institutions. We trust our own governments. And but wait, we hear that we should be more open to the international private sector. Let's square this. And instead of saying, wait, no, the British people are not an example to follow. We should do the exact opposite. Instead, what they're doing is they're doing some sections themselves to maintain in-house knowledge. And the other thing that you can do is to, again, be able to do a few things yourself so that the people who regulate can also do. So this means that you might have an overclass of regulators and managers, but the overclass is not a true overclass because these are people who, again, do things themselves. In tech industry terms, it's like being managed by someone who you know to be a programmer as well, a programmer who's maybe more experienced than you, a programmer who hopefully can still program rather than could program 30 years ago. You've seen their work. Maybe you haven't read their code or something, but you've seen work that they've done. And if you're uncertain, older employees will tell you. This is someone who will inspire you. And it's not someone who is a manager who has once heard that you can write a Hello World program. And this is, in essential, and unfortunately, the latter is the norm. Again, in the EU, but in the EU, it's not as relevant because the member states do things, and it's relevant just to the part where cross-border intercity rail in Europe is such a giant low-hanging fruit just because of these horrific low-speed gaps. They're not that hard to fix. It's just that the main beneficiary is international travel. Things like Frankfurt to Metz via Saarbrücken, if you really want to get in Turkish string via Luxembourg. Something like this. This is, I'm drawing it as like 180. I'm guessing it's 200 with, I don't know, maybe going via Kaiserslautern, maybe you can go via Mannheim, but then it means that Frankfurt, but then the trains to Paris go on the Mannheim to Frankfurt line, and in the long run, what you want to have is little, essentially every train that does not need to take the line from Frankfurt to Mannheim should not be taking the line from Frankfurt to Mannheim. It's a close second in Europe in passenger traffic density and passenger kilometers per kilometer behind Paris to the bifurcation between Dijon and Lyon. So very crowded. And remember that Deutsche Bahn was before Corona expecting ridership to double by the 2030s. It looks like it's actually going to happen with the increases in ridership. Again, Germany does not want to build, but it can. So Germany should be doing, I don't know, like Frankfurt to Mainz, but whatever. It's 200 kilometers. The terrain is not the best, but it's not also the worst. Like, this is easy. So this part is easy, and yeah, here it gets rolling, and it'll need to have some tunnels, but it's not going to have extensive tunnels. I'm going to make up a figure. I'm guessing 200 kilometers, of which 20 are in tunnel. 20 to 30, let's say, and then that is, and the 20 to 30 also mean no significant right-of-way compromises. And this means that you do Frankfurt to Paris in 2 hours flat. I get maybe 2 hours 30. No, 2 hours 15, let's say 2 hours 15, because we're assuming that you maybe even can hook to the line at a good place in France. And so 200, let's say 30 of that is in tunnel, if we're assuming like the highest possible standards. How much does that cost? German costs were said to be 30 million euros a kilometer before Corona, before inflation. So today it would be 35-ish. That is assuming average tunneling, in Germany over tunnels. So this would be, let's just get it back to 30. This is going to be about 6 billion euros. Germany can spend 6 billion euros on this. Come on. It's going to mostly benefit international travel. So this gets into diplomatic agreements in which essentially each side is trying to exploit the other. France and Germany are both, like, each of them is worse than the other. Just lock them in the room. And by them, I mean Scholz and Macron, and like have people with actual vision run things. Macron has vision. His vision is mostly his own ego. So people with vision and like normal amount of ego rather than Jupiterian amounts of ego. And so a lot of it is things are not actually that hard. It's just they're not being built. Again, in the United States it's different because the United States does not have the concept of member states with proper democratic and civilian control of the government, because the safe states are essentially run by by incompetent political commissars. There's no real difference between Democrats and Republicans in this. Um, and the swing states are essentially run by people who are trying to become president. Um, so, for example, what does the Republican Party of Wisconsin do? It's not governing Wisconsin. It's trying to lock in a Republican majority for Wisconsin. Democrats in safe states are more competent, but again, they're running for president, essentially. All of them. Like Shapiro or Whitmer. Yes, yes. The fact that the fact that so the unanimity requirements in the EU are one example of something that is obviously bad. Something that the Poles of all people should understand, that because Poland had the unanimity requirement in the same, so the Tsar could just bribe someone to say no to everything, and then Poland could not run itself, and the Tsar proposed himself as like an honest broker. And then Poland was dismembered, and most of its territory, including the capital, became the property of the Tsar. And somehow the Poles are the ones who are saying, who are even while understanding that peace lies from their teeth, through their teeth. They keep saying that unanimity is an important EU institution. Yeah, this is like unanimity means that like one I want to say racist Austrian Minister of the Interior, but Austrian and Minister of the Interior independently almost by definition imply racist. I mean, someone who is even more racist than the usual. Like, it's normal in Austria to be anti-Semitic, anti-black, Islamophobic. I don't think it's that normal to think that Bulgarians and Romanians are all going to be illegal immigrants in your country. So, yeah. Who's Adam something? There are a bunch of Adams that I know of. The one that that first comes to mind is Adam Gurry, who is American and follows me and clearly interested in issues of infrastructure and governance, but he's not focusing on infrastructure. He's focusing on like liberal governance. But anyway, the issue is that in the United States, it's not like the United States has really strong in-state networks that then have and then let's say it's not like in the United States. Let's say New York to Buffalo is really good, and Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and then the Northeast corridor's fucked up because of federal issues. No, the states are worse. The states are far worse than the federal government on this, and so the federal regulators in the United States, they nudge. You talk to them about a concrete issue, and often they will try to abstract it. They don't trust themselves. They don't think the public trusts them, because American politicians, all of them are repulsively populist by any Western European standard. And one of the things they do is they run against their own instruments of governance. It's a common thing for populists. This is why populists are so corrupt. And the fact that in Poland they somehow managed to not be Hungary levels of corrupt is a little puzzling, and I suspect it's because they constantly worry they lose. Like that they lose and that the corruption will be investigated and like get to them. It's not like the KMT in the 90s where they didn't think it would. I mean, evidently they didn't go to jail over this. And so the issue is that populists know that they are very easily replaceable. The Israeli electorate, for example, is at this point pretty right-wing. A competent-sounding center-right leader who lacked personal scandal would be able to unify Likud and succeed and get a lot of centrists to back him, so he would be able to play various potential coalition partners against one another. Let's say the more centrist ones, the religious ones, and the extreme right. But Netanyahu knows this. Netanyahu knows that someone, like a generic center-right leader, let's call him Gideon Sa'ar or Moshe Kahlon, could do this, and therefore Netanyahu aims to destroy any such leader. So this is why populists, there's kind of this kind of royalist style of populists that they destroy any possible successor because the successor could be a challenge to themselves. And this also means that they just try to grab as much money as possible. Meanwhile, again, you see it's very clear with Orban, it's very clear with Netanyahu. It's just normal behavior for American politicians, and they also run against their own institutions. So they delegitimize the state, they delegitimize the party. For example, in the United States, oh, nice. Yeah, Hungarian living in Czechia, or I guess in Germany. Is it called? Is this literally Adam something, or is it just a name, or just literally not remember the last name? Oh, that is. Oh, okay. Huh. Oh. Huh. I will look. I didn't know about it. I don't. So the content creators that I watch on YouTube are not in this sphere at all. I usually watch ones who do video game streaming, like RTS streaming. I watch Battle Order, like this person. I watch music. I used to watch a lot of like sword fans, like people talking a lot about things like medieval realism and fantasy and things like that. But when and I'm being hypocritical about this, like I kind of stopped watching when they went from like 5-minute videos to 30-minute videos, and then and this essentially went and then there's like a written blog that I just find better than these. Which is also why, like, I know there are a bunch of train vloggers that some of them like me. So I know, so Reese Martin, for example, I know pretty well. I'm in his Discord. There are ones that hate me. Like, think Alan Fisher hates me. And essentially the only time I ever hear about him is if someone will literally go into my Discord and say, Alan Fisher said XYZ, because it's not like I'm blocking him or something. It's just that I don't usually watch YouTube videos in this genre. I read more than I watch. And again, I know I'm being hypocritical about this, but I do also write blogs. But anyway, yeah. So so as I said, I do talk to federal people, and first of all, I just find them more competent than state people that I talk to. FYI. Again, I'm not going to mention names for the same reason that, like, unless it's someone who said things in public, like Jano Lieber or Jamie Torres Springer, who I have never met. I don't remember if I ever had an interaction with Jano Lieber. I certainly didn't have any with Jamie. And yeah, these people are morons and should go. And I can like explain this based on public things they've said. But again, there are other state level people who also should go, and this is based on private things. So for the same reason, I'm not going to tell you, oh, this federal regulator, this federal official is really good at their job based on things that they told me privately, but I have seen this repeatedly. But again, they want legislative solutions. They want like very policy level solutions as opposed to use these construction techniques. They're not engineers. They still work in nudge mode and not in do mode, even the very good ones. And essentially this means that you need to have, and essentially it means that you need to have a solid state with lots of professionals who are trusted and are constantly told that they're trusted, because it's so easy for politicians to run, again, against the state. Something like, oh, the bureaucrats didn't let me do this. Or often it's directed against the judiciary. We all hate whichever minority, the Muslims, the Roma, whatever, but those evil those evil unelected judges don't let me do the pogroms that we all know that we should be doing. And that leads to judicial reforms, and then, you see, the EU didn't let us do either, so we still can't do the pogroms we want. So part of it is that, but it's also done against just normal civil servants, not just judges. And a lot of people who think that, yes, minister, I mean, Yes Minister does describe a certain truth, which is that the absolute overclass of the British civil service absolutely is like that. But that's just the generalist overclass, the actual experts. Like every person beyond the span of control of someone like Sir Humphrey is going to be decent at their job, at least. Again, modulo British issues of like not being willing to learn from non-Anglos, and and so but again, it's just very normal to dump on the civil service. Um, there's a reason Yes Minister was Margaret Thatcher's favorite show. She literally wrote fanfic because she was the prime minister. Like the actors even acted out a little scene of fanfic that she wrote for them. Um, and it's even the level of party where American politicians run against their own party consultants. Like the consultants didn't let the consultants said they shouldn't do X, but we all know that X is good. And these are like all of these politicians have consultants. The consultants are all drawn from the same pool, by the way. The one attempt, so for example, someone like a progressive, like a left-wing challenger in a primary will use the same pool of consultants as the more moderate Democrat that they will challenge, and vice versa. Like for a more conservative Republican, the consultants do sort out by party, but not by stream within the party. Bernie Sanders did try to use different people in 2020, and the people he hired were beyond incompetent, like David Sirota and Bree Joy. So, but the politicians still run against their own instruments of governance. Why? Because if these instruments of government are solid, then the politician themselves is not necessary for your survival. Now, the politician obviously is not necessary for your survival, but they kind of try to portray themselves that way because that way they get to be more venal. Remember, by normal Western European standards, I suspect the majority of members of Congress from both political parties in the United States would be actually in prison, and likely nearly every governor. And yeah, I know that like my model on this is like maybe New York, it is maybe especially New York, or maybe you think New York is special. I don't think New York is special by blue state standards, and then in red states you can see exactly what DeSantis is doing. So it's so again, like a lot of it goes down to politics, the fact that the United States is governed by politicians. By think about how the United States has a mainline right party that is basically AfD, that is in many ways worse than peace, and a center left party that is it's not a radical left party. It's quite to the contrary, but it has all the venality problems that you have with like the kind of splainer faction of SPD, and also the anti-growth problems of the Green Party. Like essentially take every left of center grouping in Europe, extract their worst problem and merge them together and get a Democratic Party. So they have the do nothing aspects of SPD. They have the anti-growth aspects of the Greens. They have the kind of hostility to their own government that you see in some relict social democratic ex-communist parties in Eastern Europe. So and they have the kind of try to reinvent everything problem of like the left liberal parties, like the like D66 and their ideas of like changing the system of government or something just because they think it might do things better, like a lot of deck cherry arrangement. And yeah, this is but the upshot is that even at both the state and federal levels in the United States, the government doesn't really like doing things. It likes nudging. It avoids taking responsibility. It's the same. That is a common origin to the problem from the previous video of government by pilot. So government by nudge is a different way of avoiding taking responsibility. It's avoiding doing things yourself that can succeed or fail, which has approximately the same effect as when you try to have a scientific theory that is not falsifiable. It has, I mean, not like literally in the philosophical sense, but in the practical sense. This is what happens when you failure-proof yourself, you essentially guarantee failure, because what you're doing is you're not making sure it succeeds, you're making sure failure does not embarrass you, and therefore you will be lazy and not try to avoid failure. And essentially that's the problem with nudge, and you solve this by actually empowering the state. You empower the state against petty actors by backing your own civil service when it's in conflict with NIMBYs, which, to give credit where due, American governments do that. NIMBYs in the United States are a paper tiger. NIMBYs, I think, in most places are a paper tiger. Again, a useful thing to blame your own failures on, in the same way that that populists like to say, we wish we could do X, Y, Z, but the EU won't let us. Often about things that the EU would let you do. Like, the EU does not prevent you from being racist. Right, so the issue is not exactly small government, because, yeah, the US does have atypically low government spending for a rich country, but it's not uniquely low. And the issue is less about government spending, because, for example, Switzerland has low government spending. Rather, it's the idea that the state needs to be invisible, because if the state is visible, then it must be bad. This is often nourished by Southern revanchists, for whom the visible state took away their slaves. So quite a lot of it comes from people who know exactly that the state can do good things, and they're on the other side. In the same way that the sort of people who say that, you can't just send weapons to Ukraine, 100% of these people want Ukraine to lose. Sometimes out of literal Putinism, sometimes for other reasons, but yeah, it's the same thing. And so this means you need to empower the civil service. Again, against NIMBYs is the easy part. The NIMBYs are the local equivalent of blaming your own failures on the fact that the EU won't let you be as racist as you would like to be, which is hogwash. The EU lets you be racist. But against, for example, local politicians who try to grab other people's money, or against the United States. It was not a problem in New York or Boston, but in some other places, there's a problem where there's a very local regulatory holdup after money is committed, like the fire department in some suburb of Seattle is demanding extra funding, like extra things beyond the minimum Washington and federal fire codes, or they won't certify. Now, to be very clear, the big problems in New York and Boston, which is what we studied best, were not this, but we've heard that in both Dallas and Seattle, there are these holdups after funding has been committed, and essentially the only way to do that is to do it as kind of a repeated game where it's very clear if that happens, you will just never get federal funding again, or have the federal government take over. But both of these things require the federal government to actually be able to threaten, do you want us to manage you? Because that requires it to actually be able to manage, as opposed to just punish. Like, this needs to be a punishment for local elites who are going to be sidelined, but this needs to be viewed as, by the broad public in these areas as, those local elites were sidelined and good things happened, as opposed to, let's say, when American states take over the schools in a low-performing district, they don't do that. They essentially just extract. Because that threat, govern yourselves, or we will take over your school district, you will lose local control. It's not some kind of roving threat against localism. It's usually specifically a white majority against a black city would do that. So I think it might have actually happened to Newark. I know Patterson in Jersey was under such threat. And it averted the threat essentially by hiring a former prison administrator to run its public schools. It was I'm forgetting his name, but it was a very well-known turnaround, to the point that a lot of prisons essentially just kicked out the worst students. Worst not just in the sense of failing classes, but also in the sense of being very violent, and like focusing on like discipline above everything. So it's essentially used as punishment, rather than as rather than as just better management that will make people say, wait, there is an alternative to the local elites. We can demand the local elites do better. Because, for example, when Michigan threatens to take over Detroit or something like that, they're not trying to threaten a white flight suburb of Detroit. They're trying to be the tool with which the white flight suburbs of Detroit keep hurting Detroit, if that makes sense. But, and if you don't want it to be like it, if you want the government to actually be able to compel petty actors, the government needs to be big enough that it doesn't need to do it everywhere in the same way that the United States can manage like most of global geopolitics without invading literally every single country at once. It only needs to be able to invade two at a time. So it's the same thing. And so this means essentially being able to, let's say, threaten to have, so it essentially means being sufficiently sized to, let's say, run Dallas and Seattle or something like that, or run parts of New York being much bigger. And this is essentially what's needed. You need to do a lot of hiring of, again, professionals, not generalists, so professionals, specialists. Hire them very quickly as opposed to the 6-month, 9-month turnarounds that are typical of American federal hiring. Pay them well. But again, hire people who've done this before. Don't get like recent grads and tell them you're the overclass. They will, it'll get to their heads. This is essentially, I think, how you fix government by-nudge problems, like federal government by-nudge problems. At the EU level, it's different. I don't think the EU has a problem where it takes forever to hire and the wages are too low. I mean, I guess for like international consultants, they're too low, but the EU is not competing with McKinsey. I don't think it is. I think it's competing with, let's say, the German investment bank or things like that, or similar French institutions or things like that, where the wages are gonna. So Kaleidoceum, the wages are gonna sound absurdly high to you because this is not Indonesia. The wages are gonna sound solidly high to Pony because it's not Czechia either, but knowing what Pony does for a living, I think Pony. I think you said it on Twitter, right? That that because you're a programmer, you're top. I don't remember what you're top. I know you're top decile in Czechia. I don't remember where in the top decile, but it's not like it's an amount of money that will probably look high to you, but not very high. It's an amount of money that to me would look okay. I can see that. It's an amount of money that an American Googler would look down on. Again, in Europe, because the issue in Europe is not they can't hire. The issue in Europe is the idea that the EU can actually do things is considered so obviously false, even when the EU absolutely can do them, that they're not even trying. So the EU is actually a good example of probably can build, but certainly does not want to. I keep talking about this distinction between places that want to build and places that can't build. New York can't build and mostly doesn't want. LA can't build, clearly wants but can't. London wants but can't. Germany can build but doesn't want to build. France wants to build, can, but is losing the ability to build. I don't just mean adjusting for cost of living. The difference between Indonesia, remember, GDPs per capita are adjusted for PPPs anyway. It's just, I know what Indonesia's GDP per capita is, and by European standards, it's garble. I'm sorry. Czechia is, okay. Below. I think Czechia is still below your average, right? Because there's more Western than Eastern Europe. Even though Czechia is the richest in Eastern Europe. There's still a lot of Germany and France is still richer by a lot. It means for the EU it's not hiring a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in the EU mostly is still there. They just don't think they can do anything. Whereas if let's say the EU Green Party, if John Worth and the other people trying to push cross-border rail actually said, wait, people like the EU. There's this. There are populists who pretend that they say what everyone thinks, except they don't. They say what everyone is afraid to say because people are afraid to say it not because it's politically incorrect, but because it's false. It's how nobody, you can't say that the moon is made of green cheese. People will laugh at you. doesn't mean the moon is made of green cheese. It's kind of like being against the EU in practically every EU country. And yeah, Britain was exceptional. Um, in the EU army polling in the EU army polling, Britain was by far the most anti. Um, and so uh, so if let's say the kind of green part the GEFA people trying to do EU-wide projects, or even S&D if they decided to start doing things and not just be and not just negotiate behind closed doors with EPP, and said, okay, we have an EU-wide program. Let's do cross-border rail. Let's actually work with the member states to make sure that this is fast, that these things are fast, that this is fast, that this is fast, that this is fast, things like that. People can support that. People take trains people travel between countries. People travel between EU countries. It's something that they can actually try to run on in an election if they are perceived to be successful. I mean, it's obviously they're not going to get a majority. This is not that kind of system. Then they would be able to negotiate something like that in some kind of coalition. That's fine, but it does require doing things rather than just nudging about maybe we can remove some obscure regulation and do it in the quietest way possible so that people won't say that the EU exists as a state and that the EU is taking away our freedom in newspapers in a country that already left the EU and we don't need to care what they think. And honestly, at this point, given how their economy is doing, they kind of want to go back. Like UK polling, Brexit. Was Brexit right or wrong? 55% of people. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're still not going to go back because it's considered, it's one of those things that most people want, but they don't want to admit it. Is there something from 2022 that's saying? Oh no, right, they're only doing the polls on the actual referendum. They're not doing the polls like the subsequent ones. But yeah, I mean, you actually show the EU state as a helping hand, not just a weird grabbing hand that tells you things about the shape of bananas. Then people will support that. That's the whole thing. And bear in mind, the EU is not run by Eurosceptics. EPP is a very pro-EU party. Hell, Axel Springer is pro-EU. It's just very petty, and it's just very petty about it, and like thinks that compromises are for the weak. And this is what happens, and it leads to government by nudge, which is not actually a government. Anyway, do people have questions about this extended 2-hour rant? If not, I can just end it at 9:10, and then it's exactly 2 hour. And then it's exactly a 2-hour recording. This is 10 seconds of lag. Okay. And this is a bigger matryoshka because the chat is no longer like the chat, like OBS. It's a weird thing that it can stream to Twitch, but for some reason it cannot. On the chat for a long time was not really working well, and now it's just. Oh, okay. Thanks for watching, Connor. But I'm sorry that I never tire of. What's my opinion of the OM? I don't know. It seems like a weird thing where like they aggressively built a project that was not really the right project. They took away an important piece of infrastructure from the mainline network and severed it, and that makes a lot of commuter rail modernization intercity harder. Essentially, it boils down to the inability of Canada to do anything that touches mainline rail. But then you look in Toronto and they just can't touch mainline rail. So that's my opinion. But anyway, are there other questions like related to this? Because if not, then we can detach and like do it as an exact 2 hours. And say exact, I don't actually look at seconds because I'm not that obsessive. So yeah. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Maybe Tuesday, maybe later. Topic TBD. So anyway, thank you, and ciao.